Here with the front bench to unpack all of this, Saeed Selvam is the Vice President and Practice Lead of Public Affairs at National Public Relations. Jamie Ellerton is a Conservative strategist and founding partner of Canaptus Limited. Next to me here in Ottawa, former interim ADP National Director Carl Bélanger. He's now the President of Traction Strategies. And Marika Walsh is a Senior Political Reporter with the Globe and Mail. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you, Carl. I'll start with you. First of all, thank you for braving, public servant traffic, right, to get here. I appreciate it. Look, what do you make of this sort of the way in which everyone came out and then the statement that followed from Alberta's Premier?
It's odd, but it's not surprising, to be honest. Those are the kind of signals and messaging that she's been using. It's toned down from what we've heard in the past, but the question is, where is she? Most Canadians, most Albertans, when they're coming out of the holiday season, they just don't go on vacation right away. They go back to work, and if there's a time to be at work, it's right now. Like mere days before those tariffs are maybe going to be put in place by President Trump. So it's puzzling, and it shows that there's no united front in Canada. There's some premiers, and one premier in particular, that is not on side. Others that were not so keen seem to jump on the bandwagon today.
Yeah.
François Legault particularly, opening the door to a ban on energy export. I think that's better position than trying to stand alone somehow and not be part of Team Canada.
I think Carl's point, Marika, about other premiers kind of being less specific about their opposition to the prospective export taxes, for example, or banning energy efforts. I would include Scott Moe. Like, I just interviewed him, and he was not necessarily saying go for it, but he was definitely not being as upset or angry about the prospect of it, saying it would come way down the road, even if at all, and that there is agreement on other things that they could take away. What do you make of all that?
Yeah, I think that the premiers who were at the table in Ottawa actually made the case quite credibly against what Ms. Smith has been saying, that they shouldn't take things off the table, that it weakens their hand when they're dealing with Donald Trump, when Canada already has a weak position, frankly, going into this. The U.S. holds the cards, and that's very clear from all the statements from the premiers and the Prime Minister today. Everybody's in this sort of wait and see, kind of give yourself a bear hug Canada moment, because we don't necessarily know what will happen on January 20th. And so there's this raw Team Canada and not a lot of actual concrete information they can share with Canadians. I think Ms. Smith really undercut her argument and undercut her position by joining the meeting from some tropical location and not coming to Canada for such a consequential meeting, not coming to Ottawa, to Canada also for such a consequential meeting. But I also think, the points she has made over the last few days are not wrong. The federal government has not done anything to curry favor with her or her province in this moment, when now that sector is such a huge leverage point with the Trump administration.
Yeah, there's a couple of different ways to look at it, Jamie. I think I do understand the vantage point of premiers who are saying this undercuts their negotiating prospects collectively. I also, I was saying this to Premier Fury earlier on the show, having worked in Alberta, do understand the sentiment among Albertans and the politicians who represent them, that despite promises for a federal government to be there for them in the event that they are disproportionately impacted, they might not believe the federal government will actually have their back.
Yeah, I think the deep-seated Western alienation has a very long history in this country, especially when you look at when Trudeau is in the Prime Minister's office. And so notwithstanding some of the change being afoot, I think there's some really real concerns there. I also think, picking up on something Marika just said, it's quite easier for Danielle Smith to take a more bombastic contrary position, where she's effectively literally mailing it in and sending a written statement and popping in on a video feed, rather than actually being in the room with her fellow premiers for hours on end today working through this. I think the reality, if we look at where we're at, Vassy, is none of them actually know what's going to happen. None of them know how serious it's going to get, and none of them know the details of what the Americans are going to impose. And so the premiers are gathered today as a machinery of government, as heads of government, to suss out what the options are and kind of put everything literally on the table in a very making the sausage standpoint, where the reality is they don't even know what the main meat going into the sausage is going to be, because they don't know what yet they're responding to. So I think a lot of this is kind of political posturing, and it was easier for Danielle Smith to essentially play to her Alberta audience, where it's not even just anti-Trudeau, but anti-Ottawa resentment runs incredibly deep. And I think that's part of the dynamic of what you're seeing with the end of day of today's meetings.
To Jamie's point, though, that sentiment runs deep in Saskatchewan as well, Saeed. And Premier Moe is not taking the same posture tonight that Danielle Smith was, even though in principle he also opposes those ideas. You could tell like the like sort of what happened throughout the day was, and just for some background context, like there were supposed to be separate press conferences. They weren't even supposed to be in the same room at the end of the day. And ultimately a decision was made for them to all do that, I think, to present sort of this idea of a united front, even visually, to Canadians.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think visually it definitely landed. I think many Canadians who are seeing this are actually seeing the fact that the government is taking this seriously and responding. And so I can tell you, as just a viewer, it was heartening to see. But the presentation statute in Alberta is pretty consequential. I mean, Alberta specifically relies heavily on many U.S. purchases of it. So the export tariffs that Danielle Smith is basically saying that she would not agree to be a part of, it makes sense because there's a lot of political considerations and calculations that she's making as well. Keep in mind, she also went down to the U.S. She met with President Obama. So she's trying to also position herself as somebody who can work with the Trump administration. She's got a few things coming up, including the potential investment of a $100 billion AI data center as well, that I'm sure she would want to solicit some investments from the U.S. on. So these are some big considerations that I think that she's thinking of as she moves forward. And it's important for her to toe that line. It does not look very united, though, as you mentioned.
Carl, where does this go from here? Jamie's point about we don't know what the heck is going to happen is a salient one. We know what Donald Trump is threatening. And if that comes to fruition on Monday, we're looking at a pretty different world on Tuesday.
Yeah, and so hopefully they prepare for the worst case scenario and they're ready for it and they're ready to move early because you cannot let that percolate. You need to show that Canada is ready to take a stand and will take a stand and will defend its interest, and that the provincial premiers, most of them anyway, are on board. Because if you don't do that, then you can just see an escalation of the problems that will arise from that, and Donald Trump will benefit by winning, and that's all he wants. He wants to be the winner, and we'll see, starting next week, if he is actually a winner when it comes to relationship between our two countries.
Marika, what are you watching for next week?
Well, other than the tariff thing, I think it's important to point out, the federal government and the premiers today kind of laid into doubt whether those tariffs are coming, but Doug Ford and Danielle Smith have been very clear in the past that they are coming. I think it's also really interesting to note the Toronto Star is reporting that Canada won't do a dollar-for-dollar tariff, retaliatory tariff, because of arguments that would hurt Canada's economy even more. That's in stark contrast to what we're hearing Chrystia Freeland would be proposing. So I think we're seeing a bit of the veil lifted on maybe the disagreements within the government. It seems like Canada is trying to take a more gradual, more measured approach, but there's just everything to look forward to or to look to come Monday.
Jamie, last word to you. I've got about 25 seconds.
Yeah, I think with the ongoing power vacuum as a result of Justin Trudeau resigning, coupled with Doug Ford effectively basing his whole re-election campaign, if rumors are to be true, that he's going to go to the polls early after the premiers come back from Washington. He's controlling the agenda, he's controlling the meeting, and I think he's going to use that to his advantage. I think there's serious national unity issues at play here, and we can't take what Premier Smith is saying and just say, oh, Alberta's being Alberta. But regardless of what happens, this is going to be an absolute mess. In addition to dealing with the actual economic reality of it, every single premier is going to have a political issue on their hand. And it's probably better they hang together. Otherwise, we're definitely all going to hang alone.
All right. Well, on that rosy note, thanks, everyone. Appreciate the discussion. Jamie Ellerton, Saïd Salvem, Carl Bélanger, and Marika Walsh.